The morning Marcella Wainwright hung her dead husband's shirts on the line to sell was the morning she decided that grief was a luxury she could no longer afford. Dust devils spun lazy circles across the main street of Harlow Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, and Marcella stood in the yard behind her small clapboard house, her dark hair pinned tight against the back of her neck, her hands already raw from the washboard. The shirts were clean. They smelled like lye soap and nothing else now, and that absence of smell was its own kind of grief, but she folded it away like she folded the cotton, crisp and precise, and moved on. Her children were watching her from the back porch. 7-year-old Della sat on the top step with her knees pulled to her chest, her brown eyes following her mother's every movement the way small animals watch for weather. 5-year-old Henry was beside her, chewing on the end of his suspender strap, which was a habit Marcella had tried 3 times to break and had given up on. And the baby, 2-year-old Ruth, sat in the doorway itself with her thumb in her mouth and her corn silk hair sticking up from sleep. Thomas Wainwright had been gone 8 months. Kicked by a horse he'd been working to gentle for a neighbor, and dead by sundown of the same day. He had left behind $32 in a tin box under the floorboard, a wagon with a cracked axle, the house with 2 rooms and a leaking roof, and 3 children who still sometimes called out for him in the night. He had also left behind a wife who had loved him with everything she had, and who was now learning, with a discipline that surprised even herself, to convert that love into something useful. Into bread, into firewood, into clean laundry. The laundry business had been Ruth Calloway's idea, technically. Ruth was the postmistress and had no relation to baby Ruth, though Marcella privately found the coincidence comforting. Ruth Calloway had appeared at Marcella's door 6 weeks after Thomas died with a basket of biscuits and a piece of advice that she delivered without sentiment. "You have strong arms and a good eye for clean," she had said. "Half the men in this county are too lazy to wash their own shirts and the other half are too proud to admit they don't know how. Put up a notice at the Mercantile." Marcella had put up the notice. By spring she had a steady rotation of customers, the bachelors from the outlying farms, the 2 schoolteachers who boarded at the hotel, the deputy, whose name was Elmore Finch, and who always left his shirts inside out as if that were someone else's problem. She charged what was fair and she did the work well, and on a good week she cleared enough to buy flour, salt pork, and the occasional small sweetness for the children. On a bad week she stretched soup until it was more water than anything else and told Della it was a French recipe. Della, who was sharp as a tack and already reading from the Bible herself, had given her mother a look of pure skepticism but said nothing. The arrangement worked. It was not comfortable. It was not what Marcella had imagined when she and Thomas had come west from Missouri with a wagon full of hope and second-hand furniture. But it worked, and working was enough for now. She told herself that every morning when she lit the fire under the wash kettle, and most mornings she believed it. The first time the rancher came, it was a Tuesday. She knew it was a Tuesday because Tuesdays were when she did the pickup rounds, collecting dirty laundry from the deputy's office and the schoolteachers and old Bert Hadley at the feed store, who had more handkerchiefs than any single man had a right to. She had just returned from that circuit, her arms full and her mind on the kettle temperature, when she found the bundle on her front porch. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, the kind of careful wrapping that suggested either a particular personality or a particular occasion. There was no name on it. There was, however, a note tucked under the twine that read in a clean and even hand, "Laundry for washing. Will collect Saturday. Payment enclosed." Inside the brown paper was a second parcel, also brown paper, which contained shirts, 6 of them, heavy linen, well-made, with pearl buttons that caught the afternoon light. Riding shirts, she recognized the cut, but of a quality she did not often see in Harlow Creek. And wrapped inside the last shirt, folded in a clean square of cotton, was a coin purse. Marcella counted the money twice. Then she sat down on the porch step and counted it a third time because the number refused to make sense. $3.60 for 6 shirts. The going rate, which she had established carefully and consulted Ruth Calloway about, was 40 cents for a full load of 5. This man had left her more than triple what anyone else paid for fewer items. She looked up and down the street. The street was ordinary. Mrs. Haverson was sweeping her front walk across the way. A dog was sleeping in front of the hardware store. There was no one who looked like the owner of linen shirts with pearl buttons and inexplicable generosity. She took the shirts inside, set the coin purse on the high shelf where she kept the household money, and told herself not to spend any of it until Saturday, in case there had been a mistake, and the man came back to collect the difference. She spent none of it. She did the shirts on Wednesday with particular care, paying attention to the collars and the cuffs, working the river clay out of the left sleeve of the largest one with a soft brush before soaking. They were dirty in the way that outdoor work made things dirty, honest and deep, and she knew from the mud patterning and the specific placement of where that this was a man who worked his own land with his own hands. The kind of man who did not send a servant with his laundry because there were no servants to send, who had wrapped his own bundle and left it himself, probably before she had returned from her Tuesday rounds, so that he would not have to speak to anyone. Saturday morning, she had the shirts pressed and folded and wrapped in clean brown paper by 9 o'clock, and then spent 3 hours pretending she was not watching the front of the house. He arrived just after noon, and she only saw him for a moment before she answered the door because she caught his shape through the window first. Tall, broader through the shoulder than the door. He wore a dark hat with a flat brim and a canvas work jacket, and he tied his horse at the post with the practiced economy of someone who had done it 10,000 times and expected to do it 10,000 more. He moved like a man who had a lot of land and not enough hours in the day for it. He knocked twice, which most of her customers did not bother to do. Marcella opened the door with the bundle already in her hands. He was older than she had half imagined and younger than the other half. Perhaps 35, she thought, or a well-lived 32. He had a strong jaw and a week's worth of dark stubble and eyes the color of creek water in shadow, a kind of gray-green that changed depending on how the light hit. There was a scar along his left cheekbone that was old enough to have gone silver, and his hands, when he reached for the bundle, were the hands she had cleaned the shirts for. Large, capable, calloused in the places that told the story of his work. "Thank you," he said. His voice was lower than she expected and not unfriendly, though it was not warm either. It was the voice of a man who spoke when he needed to and was comfortable with silence otherwise. "You overpaid," Marcella said. She had decided on directness because there was no graceful way to handle the situation otherwise. Considerably. He looked at her for a moment and then looked at the bundle in his hands. "Did I? $3.60 for 6 shirts. My rate is 40 cents per 5 items." "I know your rate," he said. "Then you know you left more than triple." He shifted his weight slightly. Not with discomfort exactly, but with the adjusting quality of a man who had said what he meant and was not sure why it required further discussion. "Your rate seems low for the quality of work," he said finally. Marcella blinked. "I set my own rate." "I know you did. I'm not arguing it." He tucked the bundle under his arm. "I'll have more Saturday after next if that suits." She should have returned the difference. She had told herself clearly that she would return the difference, because accepting charity had never been in her character and she was not going to begin now. But he had said quality of work, and she found that her tongue had chosen a different direction. "It suits," she said. He nodded, touched the brim of his hat in the brief way that served as a salutation on the frontier, turned, untied his horse, and was gone. She stood in the doorway for a moment after the dust of his horse settled. She had not gotten his name. The thought occurred to her fully only after she had gone back inside, and she stood in the middle of her kitchen with a curious feeling in her chest that she could not immediately categorize. She had asked about the overpayment. She had agreed to the next Saturday. She had not thought to ask the man's name, and he had not thought or had not chosen to offer it. She asked Ruth Calloway the next morning. "Tall," Ruth said, sorting envelopes with the efficient movements of someone who had organized things for decades. Dark hat, big horse. That description covers about 40% of the county. The shirts were very fine, Marcella said. Pearl buttons, heavy linen. Ruth paused. She was quiet for a moment in the particular way she was quiet when she was turning information over carefully. Could be the Collier man, she said. He runs the Trembling Sea spread out north of the creek bend. Hasn't been in town more than a handful of times since I've been postmistress, which is going on 6 years. Collier, Marcella said, trying the name out and feeling it land somewhere in her chest with a mild and surprising weight. He keeps to himself, Ruth said. Lost someone, I believe, though I don't know the particulars and it's not my business to speculate. He's not unfriendly when he does come in, just particular about his distance. Marcella nodded and said nothing else about it because there was nothing appropriate to say. She had a man's laundry and an overpayment and a name she had learned second-hand, and that was all. The Saturday after next came around the way Saturdays do, steady and indifferent to anticipation. He was on time again, which she had already guessed he would be. The new bundle had arrived on Tuesday as the first one had, same brown paper, same twine, same brief note, same payment enclosed. This time there were 8 shirts and 2 pairs of canvas work trousers. The payment enclosed was $4.20, which was again significantly more than her standard rate, and again precisely calculated to be exactly triple what she would have charged. She had done the work with the same care as before. The canvas trousers had needed boiling and a hard scrub along the knees, which was good hard work that she did not mind, and the shirts had a particular smell of wood smoke and leather, an open land that she noticed and quickly decided she was not going to think about. When he knocked Saturday at noon, she had the bundle ready, and this time she had also prepared a receipt, written out neatly on a piece of paper that showed the items, the standard rate she would have charged, and the amount she had received. She handed it to him with the bundle. He looked at it. Something crossed his expression that she couldn't quite read, a quality somewhere between amusement and respect. "What's this for?" he said. "Accounting," she said. "So that you have a record and so that we are both clear on the terms." "The terms seem clear to me." "The terms include you paying more than 3 times what I charge," she said, "which I have accepted because the work is worth paying for and because you have made it plain that you intend to. But I want it on paper so we are both honest about what is happening." He looked at her for a long moment with those creek shadow eyes. The late spring light was coming in from the west, and it made everything warm and slightly golden, and she was acutely, irritatingly aware of the fact that he was looking at her the way people looked at things they were trying to understand. "Theodore Collier," he said. She blinked. "Since we're being honest about what's happening," he added, and there was something at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was definitely not nothing. "Marcella Wainwright," she said, because there was nothing else to do. He nodded as if he had already known, which she suspected he had. "I'll have more in 2 weeks, Mrs. Wainwright." "I'll be here," she said. This time when she closed the door she let herself stand in the hallway for a moment and do nothing, which was unusual for her. She was not a standing still kind of woman. She was a kettle on and sleeves rolled kind of woman. But she stood still for a moment and breathed, and admitted quietly to herself that Theodore Collier had a name that suited him and a quality about him that she was not prepared to examine too closely. She went to start supper. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Marcella found both practical and, in a way she refused to dwell on, something else. Every other Tuesday the bundle arrived on her porch. Every other Saturday he came to collect. The notes continued, brief and informational, and occasionally he added something specific that required particular care. A set of linen napkins that he was having laundered for a dinner he was apparently obliged to host for a neighboring rancher. A good wool vest with a particular kind of river mud in the pocket seam that he apologized for in a postscript, and the apology was so plainly worded and so completely unnecessary that she found herself smiling at it while she worked. He began to stay longer at the door. Not long. She did not think he was a man who did anything carelessly, and the lengthening of the exchanges felt deliberate in the way that all of his actions felt deliberate. The first time it happened, it was because Henry had appeared at the hallway behind her and stared at Theodore with the unblinking assessment of a 5-year-old who had not been taught yet that staring was impolite. Theodore had looked at Henry for a moment and then back at Marcella. "My son," she said. "Henry." "Hello, Henry," Theodore said, in exactly the same tone he used for everything, which was calm and direct and free of the particular kind of condescension that grown men often aimed at children. Henry pulled the suspender strap out of his mouth. "Do you have a horse?" he said. "I do," Theodore said. "Is it big? Bigger than you?" Henry considered this with great seriousness. "Most things are bigger than me," he said, and went back down the hallway. Theodore's mouth did the not-quite-a-smile thing again, and Marcella felt something warm and unannounced move through her chest. The following Saturday, Della came to the door too, less through accident than through the kind of careful positioning that suggested she had been waiting. Della had opinions about things and people, and she collected information with the purposeful efficiency of someone who planned to do something with it. "You're the laundry man," Della said. "I'm a customer," Theodore said. "The laundry is your mother's." Della accepted this distinction with a small nod. "Mama says you pay too much." "Della," Marcella said. "She said it," Della pointed out with complete accuracy. Theodore looked at Marcella with something warm in those creek-water eyes. "Your mother does excellent work," he said to Della. "It's worth paying for." Della thought about this. "She works very hard," she said, with a directness that carried more weight than she probably understood. "Since our papa died, she works very hard all the time." The silence after that was the kind that has to be let alone. Marcella did not fill it, because there was nothing to fill it with that would not make it worse. "I expect she does," Theodore said quietly, and the warmth in his voice was not pity, which was what she had braced for. It was something else, a recognition, an acknowledgement of the kind that came from knowing something about working hard in the aftermath of loss. She thought about what Ruth Calloway had said, lost someone. She had not asked who, it was not her business, but she thought about it. The summer heat arrived with a ferocity that was particular to the Texas hill country, dry and insistent, and the work of laundering in the heat was not pleasant work. The wash kettle steamed in temperatures that were already trying their best to cook everything alive, and Marcella found herself waking earlier and earlier, starting the fires at 5 in the morning, while the air was still cool enough to breathe comfortably, getting the worst of the boiling done before the sun cleared the ridge to the east. One Saturday in July she was so tired when Theodore knocked that she answered the door with her hair half-pinned and her apron still on. She realized it the moment she opened the door and felt the flash of something that was mostly pride and a small amount of something else, something more complicated. Theodore looked at her with an expression that she could not immediately read and which she later spent more time thinking about than was reasonable. It was not the look of a man cataloging a woman's appearance. It was gentler than that and more serious. "You look tired," he said. "It's July," she said, because it was the simplest true answer. "In this county, July is a cruelty," he agreed. He handed her the week's bundle, which was lighter than usual. "I kept it to the essentials." She looked at the bundle. He had, in fact, cut the load nearly in half, 5 shirts instead of 8, no additional items. She was about to say something about it when she saw that the coin inside, when she checked the note, was the same amount as always, triple pay for half the work. She stood there holding the bundle and the note and felt the words move up through her throat and then stop, because she could not figure out how to say what she felt without saying too much of what she felt. "Mr. Collier," she started. "July is no time to be boiling twice the usual load," he said simply, and the simplicity of it was what undid her, just slightly, just enough. "I'll bring the regular amount back in September." She nodded, because nodding was what she could manage. He touched his hat and left, and she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table, and was still for about 30 seconds before Della appeared from the back of the house with her arms full of dried laundry from the line and asked if supper was going to be late tonight. "No," Marcella said. "No, supper will be on time." She stood up and started it, but something had shifted. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds appear, some quality in the air that tells you the season is turning. It was not something she had asked for or expected or particularly wanted, because wanting complicated things was not something she permitted herself when there were 3 children to feed, and a leaking roof, and a business to run. But it was there, and she was too honest with herself to pretend otherwise. She had begun to look forward to Saturdays in a way that was about more than the collection of laundry bundles. The shift in Theodore was slower and more careful, but she thought she could see it, too, in the way that his stays at the door gradually lengthened. He began to ask small questions. How was the roof holding up? Whether she had managed to get the wagon axle repaired yet, which she had mentioned in passing one week as an explanation for why a delivery of goods had been late. Whether little Ruth was past the croup she had mentioned the week before. He remembered things she had said, which was the kind of detail that a person could attribute to good manners or to something more. She found herself answering his questions with a fullness that surprised her. She told him about the roof, which had been patched by her neighbor's teenage son in exchange for 3 weeks of laundry, but which she knew would need proper work before winter. She told him about the wagon, which remained unfixed because the repair cost more than she could manage. She told him that Ruth was better, and that Henry had decided he wanted to be a sheriff when he grew up, and that Della had read through the family Bible twice and was beginning to make pointed observations about the inconsistencies. Theodore listened to all of this with a quality of attention that she had rarely experienced from anyone, a kind of focused stillness that made her feel that what she was saying was worth hearing. He did not offer solutions to her problems, which she appreciated, because she had not asked for solutions. He just listened, and sometimes he said something that showed he understood, and sometimes he said nothing at all, and both were right. In August he told her, in the matter-of-fact way he told her everything, that he had spoken to a man who did carpentry work and mentioned that the Wainwright roof might need seeing to before the rains came. Marcella stopped. "You did what?" "He's looking for paid work. He'll come by if you'd like him to. If you'd rather handle it yourself, say so." "I didn't ask you to do that," she said, and she heard the edge in her own voice and did not entirely regret it. He held her gaze steadily. "I know you didn't. You wouldn't. That's not a criticism of you, Mrs. Wainwright, it's an observation," she breathed. "I appreciate the thought," she said carefully, "but I need to be able to take care of my own home." "Understood," he said immediately, and she believed him. He was not a man who argued when he recognized a point as fair. "I won't overstep again." She nodded, he nodded, he left. She stood in the doorway feeling a complicated mixture of things. The legitimate pride of a woman who had worked very hard to maintain her independence, and something underneath that was slightly less comfortable, something that felt like gratitude and something that felt like being seen. She was not accustomed to being seen in this way. Thomas had seen her, had loved her fully and well, and his death had made her invisible in the way that widowhood could do, reducing her in the town's collective eye to a need to be managed, a widow and her children, a problem to be solved by charity or by remarrying quickly or by going back east to family. She had refused all of it. She had put up her sign at the mercantile and boiled her kettle and collected her bundles and prided herself on needing no one. And here was this man, this rancher with his triple payments and his linen shirts and his particular quality of attention, who had done something kind and had been corrected for it, and had accepted the correction without defensiveness. She had not expected that. She had expected the argument that men so often made when women expressed a preference for managing their own affairs. The carpenter did not come. Theodore was as good as his word. The rains came in September before she had managed to get the roof properly dealt with, and for 3 days she moved pots around the floor catching drips and told herself it was fine. It was manageable, which it was, and also which it was not. When Theodore came on the Saturday after the rains had cleared and she had bags under her eyes from 3 nights of interrupted sleep and a tension in her jaw that she couldn't quite release, he saw it. He did not ask about the roof. He did not suggest the carpenter. He simply looked at her and then he said, "Could I take the children for a walk to the creek while you have a rest? They'd be safe. I'd bring them back within the hour." Marcella looked at him. She thought about what she knew of him. Bi-weekly customer, triple payer, man who listened, man who accepted correction, man who Ruth Calloway called particular about his distance but not unfriendly, man who had lost someone. She thought about what her children would do with an hour at the creek with a man who had a big horse and honest eyes. "An hour," she said. Theodore's expression shifted in a way she hadn't seen before. The not quite a smile became, briefly, an actual smile, and it was a revelation. It changed his whole face, softened the strong lines of it, made him look for a moment like the younger man he probably was under all that composure. "An hour," he confirmed. She called Della and Henry from the back of the house. She wrapped Ruth in a light blanket and carried her to the front porch and explained that they were going to the creek with Mr. Collier, and they were to listen to him and not put anything living in their pockets. Henry asked if he could put something non-living in his pocket. "Within reason," Marcella said. She watched them go down the street, Theodore's long strides adjusting automatically to the shorter legs of the children, Henry already talking at a volume that required no particular audience, Della walking beside Theodore with her hands clasped behind her back in the way she did when she was conducting a private assessment. Ruth was riding on Theodore's arm, small and corn silk golden, looking at the world from an altitude she didn't often get. Marcella went inside. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her forehead in her hands and let herself be still for 60 seconds. Then she got up, made a pot of coffee, and washed all the cups that had been waiting 3 days for attention. When they came back, Henry's pockets were full of smooth stones, and he had a story about a frog that had required 5 minutes to tell. Della was quiet in her particular evaluating way. Ruth had fallen asleep against Theodore's shoulder, and he carried her with a natural ease that suggested familiarity with sleeping children, which was another detail that Marcella filed away and did not immediately examine. He transferred Ruth to Marcella's arms with a care so practiced and gentle that it ached. "Thank you," Marcella said, and she meant it from somewhere considerably deeper than politeness. "She's a good baby," he said, with a plainness that held something tender in it. "All 3 of them. You've done well by them." She was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry over a compliment about her children while standing on her front porch in the September afternoon. She straightened her spine and set her jaw and said, "They make it easy." He looked at her for a moment. "Marcella," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and he seemed to realize it the moment he said it because something careful moved across his expression. "Theodore," she said back because it was the only honest response. His jaw worked slightly. He looked at the street, then back at her. "I lost my wife 4 years ago," he said. "She was sick for a long time before. I should have told you before so you understood my situation, why I keep to myself." "Ruth Calloway mentioned you'd had a loss," Marcella said. He nodded. "I don't know how to do this," he said plainly. "Whatever this is, but I think I would like to try if you're willing." She was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was doing what September afternoon light did in Texas, turning everything amber and serious and beautiful, and the children were behind her in the house, and the laundry was on the line, and Thomas was 8 months in the ground in Missouri and also in the ground here in everything that had changed about her. "I'm not sure I know how to do it either," she said. "Anymore." "Then we'll be clumsy about it together," he said, with an honesty that was more romantic than any elaborate speech could have been. "That sounds reasonable," she said, and felt something unlock in her chest that had been sealed for a long time. He came back on a Wednesday, which was not laundry day. He appeared at her door in the late afternoon with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that suggested he had thought carefully about the visit and was committed to it regardless. He asked if she would like to take a walk with him. He had asked Elmore Finch, the deputy, to keep an eye on the house and the children for an hour, which she thought later was the most astonishing piece of forward planning she had ever encountered in a man who was supposedly clumsy at this. She took off her apron and went. They walked along the main road and then down the path toward the creek, and for a while they talked about small things. The weather, the price of feed grain which had gone up, a story he had heard from a neighboring rancher about a particularly stubborn calf that had taken 11 people to handle, and then they talked about larger things. He told her about his wife, whose name had been Clara. She had come with him from Tennessee 8 years ago, and they had built the Trembling Sea together from next to nothing, and she had been sick for 2 years before she died. He spoke about her with a steadiness that held the grief cleanly, not suppressed but settled. He had loved her. The love was visible in how he spoke of her, and Marcella found that it did not make her want to run. It made her trust him more. She told him about Thomas, about Missouri and the wagon full of hope, about the horse that killed him on an ordinary afternoon, about the $32 in the tin box and the washboard and Della reading through the Bible twice. Theodore listened with his full attention, which she had already established was the kind of attention that felt like something physical, like a hand on the shoulder. "You're remarkable," he said when she finished. "I'm practical," she said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," he pointed out. She looked sideways at him on the path and found him looking at her with an expression that she could finally read clearly. It was not complicated or disguised. It was simply wanting, paired with a patience that knew how to wait. She took a breath of cool September air and said, "I'm glad you left that first bundle on my porch." Something in his face gentled. "I walked past your notice at the Mercantile 4 times before I left it," he said. 4 times, she repeated. "I'm not impulsive by nature." "I noticed," she said. There was a moment between them then, a warm and quiet pause in the middle of the path with the creek running somewhere below them and the trees going gold at the edges, and he reached out and took her hand. Just that. His large calloused hand closing around her smaller one, careful and definite. She did not pull it back. They walked back to the house that way, and when they got to the gate he released her hand with the same care he'd taken it, and said good night in his plain voice, and she said good night in hers, and she went inside with her heart conducting itself like a bird that had been let out of a room it had been in for a long time. Della was waiting in the kitchen, with an expression that combined innocence and total awareness in the precise ratio that 7-year-olds had mastered since the beginning of time. "Did you have a nice walk, Mama?" she asked. "I did," Marcella said. "Mr. Collier seems like a good man," Della said. "He does," Marcella agreed. "Henry said he told a good story about the stubborn calf," Della added, as if closing a case. Marcella kissed the top of her daughter's head and started supper. The autumn deepened and the arrangement between them deepened with it. Theodore came on Saturdays as always for the laundry, but now sometimes came on Wednesday evenings as well, sitting at the kitchen table while Marcella cooked, and the children spun around him in various orbits of attention. Henry had graduated from asking about the horse to asking detailed questions about cattle ranching that Theodore answered with the same seriousness he brought to everything. Della had begun lending him books from the small shelf they owned, very seriously, one at a time, with instructions for their return. Ruth, who trusted people on a schedule of her own that no one could predict or control, had decided that Theodore Collier was a person she would climb on whenever proximity allowed. He was patient with all of it. He was patient with Ruth on his knee at the table and Henry's unceasing commentary and Della's evaluating gaze and the general productive chaos of a household with 3 children in it. He was not performing patience. She could tell the difference. He genuinely did not seem to mind the noise, and she suspected that the quiet of his ranch, which must have been considerable after Clara died, was a different kind of quiet than the quiet he preferred. He stayed for supper one Wednesday in October, and after supper she put the children to bed and they sat on the front porch in the cool dark and talked for a long time. She asked him once, gently, whether he wanted children of his own, and the question hung briefly in the dark air between them. "I would have," he said. "Clara and I tried, it didn't happen. I've made a kind of peace with it." He paused. "Your children don't need a replacement for their father," he said. "But if they'd have me in whatever capacity felt right to them, I would be glad of it." She looked at his profile in the dark, the line of his jaw and the steady set of his eyes on the street, and thought that Thomas would have liked him. The thought was unexpected and arrived with a warmth that surprised her, not pain but something more complicated and more generous. "Henry already calls you Mr. Theo," she said. "I noticed," he said, and the smile she was beginning to love was in his voice even when she couldn't see it. "Della will take longer," Marcella said. "She's cautious with her affections. She got it from me." "I'm patient," he said. "I noticed that too," she said. The cold came in November the way it always did in the hill country, sudden and uncompromising. Marcella's firewood supply was thinner than it should have been, and she knew it. And she had begun the private arithmetic of February, calculating how far the current supply would stretch, and whether she could afford to buy more, which she could if she had 2 more good weeks with the laundry customers, which she probably would. She had not mentioned any of this to Theodore, because she had her pride and also because she was managing. She came out one Tuesday morning in the dark cold before sunrise to start her fires and found a cord of firewood stacked against the side of the house. Properly stacked, covered with oilcloth against the moisture enough to last the winter. She stood looking at it in the dark with her breath making small clouds in her hand on the cold wood. There was no note, she did not need one. On Saturday she said to him when he came, "The firewood." "The winter is cold," he said simply. "Theodore," she said. "I didn't ask," he said. "I know, I'm sorry," but the apology was mild and they both knew that he was not very sorry. He held her gaze and she held his, and the moment stretched between them like something being tested for tensile strength. "You can't just do things," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm still learning the limits." She was quiet for a moment. "It was kind," she said finally. "It was very kind, thank you." Something in him relaxed just slightly. "You're welcome," he said. She handed him his laundry bundle. Their fingers overlapped on the paper for a moment and neither of them moved. "Would you come for Thanksgiving?" she said, which she had not planned to say but which felt entirely right once it was out. He looked at her with those creek shadow eyes. "I would like that very much," he said. Thanksgiving was a small and good and particular kind of perfect. Marcella cooked everything she knew how to cook with everything she had, which was more than it had been the year before because of the better laundry income, and the house smelled of roasting meat and cinnamon, and the pine branches she'd put on the table for decoration. Theodore arrived with 2 bottles of good apple cider and a carved wooden rabbit that he gave to Ruth without ceremony, which Ruth accepted without ceremony and immediately carried to the corner to examine. Henry spent the period before dinner explaining to Theodore in detail how he intended to raise cattle when he grew up and be a sheriff at the same time, a career combination he felt was underexplored. "It's an ambitious double appointment," Theodore said with great seriousness. "Papa used to say to think big," Henry said, and then looked briefly uncertain in the way he always did when he mentioned Thomas without preparation. Theodore did not sidestep it. "That sounds like good advice," he said. "Did you have a papa?" Henry asked. "I did. He died some years ago." "Does it stop hurting?" Henry asked, and the kitchen went very quiet. Theodore looked at the boy for a moment with a care that Marcella felt in her whole chest. "It changes," he said. "It doesn't go away, but it changes into something that fits inside you better, and you keep the good things. The advice about thinking big, for instance, you'll carry that." Henry thought about this with his serious 5-year-old face. "All right," he said, and accepted it, the way children could accept things when they were told truly. Della watched the whole exchange from across the table and said nothing, but Marcella caught her daughter's expression, saw the small careful thing that had shifted in it and understood. They ate. They talked. The afternoon light came through the windows and lay across the table and the faces of the people around it, and Marcella looked at all of it. the half-eaten plates and the children's animated faces and Theodore's large hands around the cider cup, and felt something bloom through her that she recognized finally as happiness. Not the completed happiness of before, which had been real and was gone. This was something new, something built from different materials, harder and more deliberate and no less warm. After dinner, while the children napped, she and Theodore washed the dishes together. It was so domestic and ordinary that it was almost funny, the two of them at the kitchen basin, and she laughed at something small and heard him laugh back, properly this time, a full sound that she stored carefully. "Marcella," he said when the dishes were done, turning to face her in the kitchen. "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said, plain as everything he said. No performance, no ceremony. Just the truth stated clearly, the way he stated all truths, because he was a man who had decided a long time ago that the truth was less complicated than the alternatives. She looked at him for a moment in the afternoon kitchen light, this man who had left a bundle on her porch and triple the payment with no name, who had listened and waited and brought firewood and carried her sleeping daughter with gentle arms, who had told her boy that grief changed shape but the good things remained. "I love you too," she said, which was also true, and also plain, because she had learned honesty from the same school of hard experience he had. He crossed the small kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in his hands, careful as everything he did, and kissed her once with a tenderness that was precise and unhurried, and she kissed him back with the same quality. They stood in the kitchen for a moment in the particular silence of two people who have just said something they cannot take back and have no desire to. "What happens now?" she asked. "Whatever you'd like to happen," he said. "At whatever pace feels right. I'm not in a hurry." She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to be in love again, to be choosing someone again, to be allowing someone to choose you. It was not a small thing. It was a very large thing, and it came with children and history and a leaking roof now repaired by a cord of firewood's worth of trust. "Come for Sunday dinners," she said, "and we'll see." He nodded. "Sunday dinners," he said, with the satisfaction of a man who had been offered something he genuinely valued. The Sunday dinners were a good idea. They were easy and regular and gave the children time to adjust, which all 3 of them did in their own ways. Henry adjusted immediately and completely, designating Theodore a primary source of livestock information and questionable frontier career advice. Ruth adjusted on her own timeline, which turned out to be about 3 Sundays, after which she behaved as if she had always sat in Theodore's lap at the dinner table, which was apparently where she preferred to be. Della took longer, as predicted, but Della's version of coming around was a single particular moment one Sunday in December when she handed Theodore a book from the shelf and said, "This one has a character like you in it," and Theodore had read the first page with full attention while Della watched. "How am I like him?" Theodore asked. "He thinks before he talks," Della said. "Not many people do." Theodore looked at her with great seriousness. "That might be the finest compliment anyone has given me," he said. Della allowed herself a small smile. The case, as far as Della was concerned, was settled. December brought the first real cold, and Marcella's laundry business contracted slightly, as it always did in winter, when some customers stopped sending things and managed their own. She had enough put by to carry through to spring, which was new. A year ago she would not have been able to say that. The triple payments had made a measurable difference, stacked carefully in the tin box that no longer lived under the floorboard but on the kitchen shelf where she could see it. Christmas was a held-breath kind of joy, the kind that you assemble carefully from limited materials and which turns out to be better for the craft of it. Marcella made sugar cookies and paper stars. Theodore appeared on Christmas morning with 3 gifts, one for each child, sensible and warm and chosen with the evidence of genuine attention. A pair of good leather gloves for Della, sized correctly for small hands. A picture book about horses for Henry, who consumed it in approximately 40 minutes and then wanted to discuss it at length. A soft cloth doll for Ruth, who named it Theodore immediately, which produced a warmth in the man's expression that Marcella thought she could look at indefinitely. After the children were in bed that night, Theodore sat with Marcella by the stove and she leaned against his shoulder, and he kept his arm around her, and they were quiet together in the way that two people are quiet together when the quiet is as comfortable as the talking. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I want to ask you properly. When it's time. I don't think it's time yet because the children need more time and you need whatever time you need and I want to do it right. But I want you to know it's coming." She looked at the stove for a moment. "Is this you giving me warning so I can prepare a proper answer?" "Partly," he admitted. She tilted her head up to look at him. His face was close and warm in the firelight, and the scar on his cheekbone was familiar to her now in the way that all his features had become familiar, catalogued and known. "My answer will be yes," she said, "when you ask." His arm tightened around her shoulders. "Good," he said quietly. He asked her in February. He had thought about it as he thought about everything, and he had arranged it with a care that she found entirely characteristic. He came on a Sunday afternoon when the children were visiting with the Calloway family, which Ruth Calloway had arranged with a warm smile and absolutely no pretense of its being accidental, and he arrived at the door with nothing in his hands, which was unusual enough that she noticed. He came inside and stood in the kitchen where they had washed the Thanksgiving dishes together and where he had first told her he loved her, and he said, "Marcella, I've been thinking about what my life looks like, and I've been thinking about what I want it to look like, and those two things only match up in one way, and that way includes you and your children." "Theodore," she said. "I have a good ranch," he said. "It's not fancy, but it's solid and it's paid for. The house could use a woman's eye and the land could use the sound of children. I could use a partner, not someone to manage, not someone to take care of, a partner. Someone who tells me when I've overstepped and someone I can tell the truth to and someone who will let me bring firewood without too much argument." She laughed, which broke the solemnity of the moment in exactly the right way. He reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a ring. It was not elaborate. A simple gold band with a small oval garnet, dark red, modest and well-made. "It was my mother's," he said. "I want you to have it if you'll have me." She looked at the ring in his large, calloused hand and felt everything that she was, feel everything that he was, the whole weight of both their histories and the whole impossible lightness of what was in front of them. "Yes," she said, "as I told you I would." He slid the ring onto her finger and then took her hand in both of his and held it just that. "We'll figure everything out," she said. "Together," he said. They were married in April of 1879, in the small church in Harlow Creek on a morning when the bluebonnets were starting along the roadsides, and the air had that particular quality of Texas spring, warm enough to be kind and cool enough to be honest. Ruth Calloway cried, which she denied afterward. Deputy Finch attended and someone had ironed his shirt for the occasion, which Marcella noticed and found touching. Della stood up with her mother in a dress that had been let out at the hem and refitted at the waist, and held herself with a gravity that the occasion warranted. Henry wore his best clothes without destroying them for an unprecedented 23 consecutive minutes. Ruth, magnificent in white, spent a portion of the ceremony attempting to climb the pew. Theodore stood at the front of the church in a suit that he had clearly had cleaned by someone, possibly himself, and watched Marcella walk toward him with an expression on his face that was entirely transparent for the first time she had known him, all the composure set aside, just a man watching the woman he loved come toward him with his heart on his sleeve where anyone could read it. She reached him and took his hands and felt steady. The minister asked the questions and they answered them, and when Theodore said "I do," he said it the way he said everything, plain and certain and with no particular drama, because the truth required none. She said "I do" back, and meant every syllable. The move to the Trembling Sea happened over the following 2 weeks, organized by Marcella with the systematic efficiency that she brought to everything, and by Theodore with a patience for chaos that she was beginning to understand was fundamental to his character. The house on the ranch was larger than she'd expected, a proper two-story structure with 4 rooms upstairs and a kitchen that had a good stove, and it smelled of horses and wood smoke, and an absence of people that she immediately set about filling. She brought her washboard and her kettle, which Theodore helped her install in a specific outbuilding that was better suited to laundry work than any space she'd had before. He had arranged it before she arrived, built the shelves himself, hung the line in the right place. She looked at it and felt the complicated emotion of being truly known. She kept the laundry business. She had thought about giving it up and decided against it, because it was hers and it had kept her family alive, and she was not sentimental about it, but she was honest about what it represented. Theodore had no objection. More than that, he seemed to understand without her having to explain. The ranch hands who worked the trembling sea, 3 of them including a quiet older man named Piers and a young Mexican cowboy named Eduardo, who was 17 and phenomenally good with horses, and who Theodore was teaching everything he knew, adjusted to the new household with varying degrees of smoothness. Piers was polite and reserved. Eduardo was delighted and immediately became Henry's primary research source on horse-related matters. Henry was in heaven. Della found the ranch library, a collection of about 40 books that Theodore had accumulated over the years, and read her way through it with focused joy. Ruth conducted a thorough investigation of every corner of the property and designated her preferred locations. The family settled. It was not seamless, because real life was not seamless, but it was genuine, and genuine things had a solidity that seamless things often lacked. There were adjustments and renegotiations, and one evening when Della cried quietly in her room for her father, and Marcella sat with her for a long time, and Theodore left them alone in the way that showed he understood when to leave people alone. And the morning after that, Della came to breakfast with her chin up and her eyes clear, and Theodore had the coffee ready. Summer came and Marcella's laundry business, now conducted from better facilities with a cleaner water source, expanded. She added 2 new ranch families as clients. She adjusted her rates, still fair but somewhat less generous to herself than they had been, and was busy in a way that felt productive rather than desperate. Theodore asked her, in the evenings when the children were in bed and they sat together on the porch of the ranch house watching the last light go off the land, what she wanted for herself, beyond the practical matters. She thought about it seriously, because he always asked things seriously. "I want the children educated properly," she said. "I want Della to have more books than we can carry. I want Henry to grow into a man who thinks as well as he talks, which will require significant work. I want Ruth to know that she's capable of anything." She paused. "And I want this," she said. "What we have, I want to keep having it." He looked at her in the evening light. "What about you?" he said. "Not the children, you." It was such an unusual question. She sat with it for a moment, genuinely sat with it because it deserved sitting with. "I want to keep doing the laundry," she said finally, and felt slightly ridiculous saying it, and then felt not ridiculous at all because it was true. "Not because I have to, because it's mine, because I built it." "Then keep it," he said simply. "I want to read more," she added. "Della's not the only one who got through the Bible twice." "I'll order books," he said. "And I want—" She stopped. He waited. "I think I would like another child," she said carefully. "If it's possible, if you want that. I know you said you had made peace with—" "Yes," he said. The word came out with a completeness, a fullness that covered the rest of whatever she had been going to say. He turned to look at her, and his expression was something she had only begun to learn, something open and enormous and careful all at once. "Yes," he said again, more quietly. "I would like that very much." She took his hand on the porch railing. The autumn of 1879 was good in all the ways that counted. The ranch had a productive season. The laundry business was steady. Della had worked her way through 15 of Theodore's books and had opinions about each of them. Henry had ridden a horse by himself for the first time, supervised by Eduardo, and had come in for supper walking in a different way than he had walked before, with the particular straightness of a boy who has done something he's been waiting to do. Ruth, now 3, had words for everything and used them constantly and without restraint. And in November, Marcella told Theodore that she was expecting. He went very still for a moment in the way he went still when something mattered. Then he pulled her carefully to him and held her, his chin on the top of her head, and she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek, and it was very fast for a man who was ordinarily so composed. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm healthy and I'm happy," she said. "Both." She felt him breathe. "Good," he said, and there was a world in that single syllable. She told the children at supper. Henry's response was immediate and enthusiastic. He needed to know immediately whether the baby would be able to ride. Della calculated the probable arrival date with startling accuracy. Ruth, who was unclear on the concept but sensitive to the mood, decided that everyone smiling meant something good and smiled back. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the winter Marcella stopped taking cold for granted. Theodore kept the house warm with a deliberate thoroughness that she recognized was specifically for her, stoking the stoves carefully before bed, ensuring she never had to carry the heavy wood herself, not because she couldn't but because he wanted to. She accepted it this time without argument, because she had learned the difference between charity and care, and this was care. She continued working through the winter, adjusting her pace as necessary, and being honest with herself about what her body could manage. Theodore watched with the same quality of attention he'd always had, and said nothing except to ask occasionally if she needed anything, and to always have the answer available when she said yes. Eduardo, who turned out to be a person of considerable feeling, made her something from supple leather in the evenings, a small bag for carrying things, which he gave her with immense shyness, and which she accepted with genuine warmth. Piers cut more wood than the winter required and stacked it carefully, which was his version of the same. The baby came in late June of 1880, on a morning that arrived cool and bright after a week of heat, as if the weather itself had made an accommodation. He was a boy, healthy and loud, with a quantity of dark hair that he had clearly inherited from his father and a lung capacity that left no room for uncertainty. They named him James Thomas Collier. The Thomas was Marcella's, given quietly and deliberately, and Theodore had been the one to suggest it. She lay in the bedroom in the afternoon light with the baby in her arms and Theodore beside her, and she looked at the combination of them, this person they had made, and thought about how life collected things, how loss and survival and stubbornness and triple payments and laundry bundles and Sunday dinners could build over time into something this complete. "Hello, James," she said to the baby, who regarded her with the ancient indifferent wisdom of newborns. "He has your forehead," Theodore said. "He has your everything else," she said. Theodore touched the baby's hand with one finger, and James's hand closed around it with the instinctive grip that meant nothing yet and everything eventually. "Thank you," Theodore said very quietly, and she knew he was not only talking about James. "Thank you," she said back, and meant the same expansive thing. The years that followed were built from the ordinary materials of a good life, the kind of life that looks unremarkable from the outside and is irreplaceable from within. The ranch grew steadily under Theodore's management, expanding the herd by 20 head in 1881 and adding a proper barn that same year, which Eduardo helped design and which Henry, now 10, participated in building with an enthusiasm that was more useful than expected. Della was 12 and had opinions about everything and was right about most of them. Marcella wrote a letter to the school in the county seat inquiring about proper educational opportunities, and Theodore rode there himself to speak to the schoolmaster, and the result was an arrangement whereby Della corresponded with a teacher there and received regular coursework. This was not common for girls in 1881, which Marcella was well aware of, and she pursued it with the same tenacity she brought to the washboard. She could go to school in the city, Theodore said one evening. Marcella looked at him. She won't want to leave. She might later. If she does, we'll make it possible. This was the kind of thing he said, quiet and matter-of-fact, about futures that other men of his time and place would not have imagined for a daughter. Marcella loved him for it with a specific precision. Ruth, 4 and then 5, was a force of small nature, absolutely impossible to discourage about anything. She decided at 4 that she would be a doctor when she grew up, based on nothing that anyone could identify, and maintained this position with serenity. James, meanwhile, was everything a small child should be, curious and demanding and periodically hilarious. He followed Theodore like a shadow from the moment he could walk, and Theodore bore this with the patience that had characterized everything else about him. There were hard things, too. 1882 brought a dry summer and a poor grazing season that made the ranch ledgers difficult. Theodore worked longer hours and came in at the end of some days with a tiredness in him that was deep and bone level. Marcella cooked good suppers and kept the household organized and expanded the laundry business to 2 more clients and said nothing about any of the financial worry unless he brought it up first. And when he brought it up, she talked it through with him as an equal, because they were partners and he had said so and she held him to it. The season turned. The rains came in the spring of 1883, and the land recovered with the generosity that land had when given the chance. The herd was strong and prices were favorable, and Theodore came in from the range one May afternoon looking lighter than he had in a year. "We're all right," he told her, in the kitchen where she was rolling biscuit dough. "I know we're all right," she said, which was mostly true and also a choice. He kissed the side of her head and she leaned into it briefly and then went back to the biscuits. Piers retired that year, amicably, and with a gift of a good horse that Theodore gave him in the straightforward way he gave people things, without drama. Eduardo, now 22, had become the head hand, which was a different kind of recognition in that time and place, and he wore the responsibility with a quiet dignity that made Marcella think of herself in those first difficult years, the specific self-possession of a person who has something to prove and knows they are capable of proving it. She had occasionally to defend Eduardo's position to visiting ranchers who expressed reservations couched in the language of the time, the ugly and casual dismissals that were as much a part of that era as the dust and the heat. Theodore handled it with a bluntness that she admired. He did not argue or explain. He stated the case once and clearly, and anyone who continued to press it on his property was not welcome on it. This was understood. Henry, 13 in 1885, was by then a legitimate help on the ranch, riding with Eduardo and Theodore, and holding his own at work that required actual strength and skill. He had grown into the promise of himself, Thomas's son in his openness and Theodore's apprentice in his growing thoughtfulness, and watching him, Marcella sometimes had the whole complicated joy of knowing that a child had been given what he needed. Della had read everything available and was writing. She had started keeping a journal that she did not show anyone and produced occasional essays that she did show her mother, carefully crafted and startlingly perceptive. She was 16 in 1886, and Marcella wrote more letters to more schools. Ruth, 10, had not abandoned the doctor idea, and had instead expanded it to include a practical curriculum of nursing every injured animal that came to her attention, which was a considerable number given the ranch environment. Theodore built her a small outbuilding she called her hospital, which Marcella found disproportionately touching. James, 6, was a horse-mad, dirt-collecting, story-requesting small person who had his father's patience and his mother's fire, and who slept every night as if sleep were a competition he intended to win. He called Theodore Papa with the simplicity of a child who had only ever known one father, and Theodore responded to it with a warmth that never became something he took for granted. There were evenings when Marcella stood at the kitchen window in the early dark and watched the light from the lantern in the barn where Theodore and Henry were doing the last of the evening chores, and heard James inside asking Della to read him something, and heard Ruth in her hospital making reassuring sounds at whatever she was currently treating, and felt the wholeness of it as something almost physical, something she could hold. It had come from a laundry bundle and a triple payment, and a man who had walked past a notice at the mercantile 4 times before leaving it on her porch. She thought about Thomas sometimes, still. She thought about him when something made her laugh unexpectedly, because Thomas had made her laugh. She thought about him when Henry said something that was unmistakably his father's thinking in his father's cadence, refracted through a different voice. She thought about him when she looked at the garnet ring on her right hand now, moved there when Theodore put the gold band on her left, wearing both because both were true. She did not think that loving Theodore diminished what she had had with Thomas. She had decided early and firmly that this was not a competition, and there was nothing to diminish. The heart was not a fixed quantity. She knew this because she had thought it was, and then it had expanded again in ways she had not asked for and could not have predicted, and here she was with more than she had imagined having. In the spring of 1887, Della was accepted to a school in San Antonio. A proper school, one that offered young women a real education, and the letter of acceptance came on a Tuesday morning, and Della read it once at the kitchen table, and then read it again, and then set it down carefully and looked at her mother with an expression that was pure unguarded joy, which was rarer from Della than from almost anyone. Theodore arranged the enrollment fees with the same practical directness he arranged everything. Della left in September, and the house was different without her, quieter in a particular way that was not comfortable at first. Marcella missed her with a specific physical ache that she worked through by continuing to work. Theodore missed her too, she thought, the particular quality of Della's presence at the supper table, the serious lending of books. But Della wrote letters. Long, intelligent, observational letters full of what she was learning and thinking and who she was becoming, and the letters were so precisely Della in their texture that they were almost like having her there. She came home for Christmas, and she was the same and different in the way that growing always made people, more herself in some directions and still discovering herself in others, and the Christmas table felt full again. Ruth, 12, made a solemn pronouncement at Christmas dinner that she intended to be the best doctor in Texas, and no one at the table doubted her. Theodore told her, with the same seriousness he had always brought to Ruth's plans, that the best doctors he'd known had all started by paying careful attention to everything around them. Ruth said she was already doing that. He said he knew. 1888 brought another baby. Marcella had not quite expected it, being 37 and having thought perhaps the family was complete. She told Theodore on a February morning with a mix of emotions she couldn't entirely untangle, and he sat down at the kitchen table in a way that made her realize he needed a moment, and then he looked up at her with an expression that was wholly and without reserve joyful. "Are you well?" he asked. "Perfectly," she said. He stood and held her in the kitchen, and she felt him shake once, just slightly, with something too large for the room. The baby was a girl, born in October when the oaks were going gold, and they named her Clara Me. The Clara was Theodore's, given with a quiet and loving generosity that Marcella understood completely, and Me was a name they had simply liked together. The night Clara was born and sleeping and the house was quiet, Marcella lay in the good tired of it, and Theodore sat beside the bed holding her hand, and she said, "Is she what you imagined?" He looked at the baby in the cradle for a long moment. "She's more," he said. "Everything has been more." The years continued in the way that years continued when they were full of living people and real work and the particular texture of a family that had been built carefully and honestly from difficult materials. Della came home from San Antonio in 1890 with her certificate and her journals and a brightness in her that was her own light, entirely grown now, and she settled in the county seat nearby and began teaching at the school there. The same school Theodore had ridden to 7 years before to ask about her education. Marcella thought about that and felt the specific satisfaction of things arriving where they were always supposed to arrive. Henry was 18 in 1890, And in the spring of that year he told his mother and Theodore, at supper, that he'd been offered a deputy position in the next county over. And his face when he said it was the face of a boy who had grown completely into himself. Marcella looked at him across the table. Thomas's openness, Theodore's caution learned over years, the specific combination of who he had become. "Your father would be proud," she said, and meant both of the fathers. Henry's throat moved. "I know," he said, "both of them." Theodore put his hand briefly on Henry's shoulder and said nothing, which was exactly right. Eduardo married in 1890 a woman named Catalina who was fierce and practical and whom Marcella immediately loved. They built a small house on the edge of the property that Theodore had offered them, and Catalina joined Marcella's laundry business as a partner, which Marcella had been considering for some time, and which proved to be one of the better decisions she'd made. Ruth, 14, watched all of this growth and change with her characteristic collecting attention, and made notes that no one saw and drew conclusions that she would eventually bring to bear on the world. She was already the person who would be a doctor. It was as settled as the oak trees. James, 10, was growing up with the ranch as his whole world and seemed to have no complaints about it. He had Theodore's composure beginning to surface under the child's volatility, and he rode as well as Eduardo and better than Henry had at his age, and he talked to the horses in a low voice that Marcella sometimes overheard, and which sounded remarkably like his father's. Clara Mee, too, was a separate world unto herself, with opinions that she communicated at volume and a persistence that surpassed even Ruth's. She had Marcella's dark hair and Theodore's eyes, and she had already identified Piers's old cat, which had somehow survived to an improbable age on the property, as her personal companion. The Christmas of 1890 was the fullest table they had ever had. Della home from the county seat, Henry home from his deputy post, Eduardo and Catalina, Ruth and James and Clara Mee and Theodore and Marcella. Ruth Calloway came for Christmas dinner, as she had for several years, being family in all the ways that mattered even though none of the names matched. Marcella looked at the table. She thought about a morning in 1878, a washboard and cold hands and $32 in a tin box. She thought about a notice at the mercantile and a bundle on a porch and a note that said payment enclosed. She thought about triple the payment for 6 shirts and a man who walked past a notice 4 times before leaving it. She thought about Saturday mornings and laundry bundles and a hand taken on a path and an honest voice saying, "Whatever this is, I think I would like to try." She thought about a garnet ring from a mother she had never met and a cord of firewood in the dark, and a man carrying her sleeping child with steady arms. Theodore was at the other end of the table, Clara Mee in his lap, talking to Henry about something to do with the eastern counties. He looked up and found her looking at him, and his expression did the thing it had done from the beginning, the not quite a smile becoming a real one, private and warm and precisely for her. She smiled back with the whole of what she felt, which was considerable. Della, seated beside her, said quietly, "You look happy, Mama." "I am," Marcella said. "Good," Della said simply, and turned back to the conversation she'd been having with Eduardo about the prospects of formal schooling in the region, which was a conversation Della intended to do something practical about, which everyone at the table knew. After dinner, while the others talked in the big room and the children played and Clara Mee attempted to climb everything that held still long enough, Marcella slipped out to the back porch in her shawl. The night was cold and clear, the sky the particular black of winter nights in the hill country, crowded with stars. She could hear the sounds of the ranch in the dark, the horses in the barn, the wind along the fence line, the distant sound of the creek. Theodore appeared behind her as she had known he would and put his coat around her shoulders over the shawl. "You'll freeze," he said. "I'm looking at the stars," she said. He stood beside her and looked at them too. They were quiet together in the easy way they had been quiet together for 12 years. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," she said, "if you'd walked past the mercantile a 5th time?" "Yes," he said without hesitation, and And I'm glad I stopped at 4, he paused. I'm glad you opened the door on Saturday. I was going to return the overpayment, she said. I had it in my mind to return it. I know I saw it in your face. What stopped me? He was quiet for a moment. Quality of work, he said mildly with the not quite a smile in his voice. She laughed, and the sound went up into the cold, clear air and was itself for a moment clear and real. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and they stood looking at the stars over the trembling sea, while the sounds of their family continued inside, warm and various and entirely alive. "We should go in," she said without moving. "We should," he agreed without moving either. They stood there a moment longer, in the dark and the cold and the fullness of it, this rancher and this widow who were neither of those things any more and both of those things always. This man who had left triple the payment and no name. This woman who had answered the door and set its suits with her pride intact and her heart already, without knowing it, beginning to open. Then they went inside, where the light was, where the children were, where the table held the evidence of everything they had built. The door closed behind them. The stars continued their patient and ancient watch over the trembling sea, over the good solid house and the barn and Eduardo's light in the small house at the edge of the property, and the fence lines running clean into the dark, over the laundry outbuilding with its proper shelves, over all the accumulated ordinary magnificent evidence of two people who had found each other on the far side of grief and had chosen, carefully and deliberately, and without drama, to stay. The creek ran on in the dark, cold and clear and continuous, the way water always did, the way time always did, carrying everything forward toward whatever came next, which was good, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was everything.